Alright, Leningrad. I'm sure I have a whole lot to say about this, but we'll see if we can drag it out a little bit. It's a small game. S&T magazines were coming out bigger at the point where this was published. Maybe 100 counters, I don't know. I'll probably tell you here. Not sure. The rules are written in a style that SPI was following around this era. It's kind of the, let's try to get a new generation of gamers interested. One of the problems was this would have to catch that new generation on the shelves, basically. Some of the games were published either in S&T's Ares magazine, which probably was the better route for it. But others got this kind of thin box treatment. It was intended to be kind of an introductory level war game. As such, you have to kind of judge this one in terms of what does it lead you to in other games, and it's kind of odd in that sense because it has a sort of, I'm not going to say particularly innovative combat system, but the combat system is a little off sort of the main line of the games that were coming out, earlier in that decade, basically, when SPI started. And in terms of functionality, the system does provide a slightly different type of game. It's still a game where you have to worry about, getting on the right odds chart, but you have the option to retreat, to give territory for casualties, or to make the other side of things, as opposed to the fixed values that were more common throughout most of the games. Some of the ideas incorporated into here are ideas that SPI was playing with more than maybe Avalon Hill was for the most part. Things like, let's use column shifts for representing terrain rather than just a multiplier to the combat strength. And also for certain special circumstances. And as such, it is sort of a step towards things that SPI was putting out, but I'm not sure how well they sort of hung on as ideas, The reasoning there being, if you want to bring new people into the hobby, well, you've got to provide them something that follows on this fairly closely. And there wasn't anything that directly was like this that I'm aware of. It was kind of an innovative mixture of concepts, some of which, would all be packaged together in the same game, but a little less, I don't know. It didn't hang together. It doesn't immediately lead me to, if you like this game, you should be getting these. And there also isn't some sort of advertising flyer. Now, I don't know. There certainly was there was a sheet of paper that goes on the back of these. And when I got this used game, it didn't come with that. So maybe that kind of information was on there. But I think to provide that kind of, boost, it would have made sense to say, here are some other games that are similar to this, so that you can take, the knowledge that you have from here and lead into it. Some of those, I don't know, they felt like pretty big jumps up from this. And that's kind of the thing, is this is sort of on the lines of a tiny, it's sort of like the Napoleon at Waterloo game, right? For a new era, But Napoleon at Waterloo led into a whole bunch of things that were essentially the same level of complexity, that were, bigger. And not just Napoleonics, in other periods as well. And that's what's kind of missing here, was there was nothing to shift you to it. Now, when Napoleon at Waterloo first came out, it was not being released as some sort of, here's for all the new gamers. It was a couple years before this that they released Napoleon at Waterloo as a free giveaway, that would be available. I got it from somebody who was a subscriber to S&T, but he had a pile of them, as if he was probably through the club that he interacted with, trying to foster a new generation, and that there was this kind of outreach effort going through that. A game like this, the only way you'd find it is looking in the wargame section. It doesn't have a big amount of shelf space, which is important because it's cheap too, right? But it also wasn't in the tiny little section where you might pick up those little games. It was a hard job to move that new generation to wargaming. The generation before, well, the half generation, 10 years before, there was a real craving from the kids, I think, for the military simulations, and then the whole fantasy and science fiction and the role-playing side of things took a much bigger share of that new breed of gamers, and it was hard to move them into the wargaming. And this was obviously not going to do it on its own. And I don't feel like there was any kind of really strong effort to do so. One of the problems, of course, was SPI didn't have a lot of shelf space in a lot of places. It was I mentioned this before, I think in the intro, it was very hard to find in my area, for example. There were other areas of the country, maybe further from New York City for whatever reason, that SPI had a bigger capability to be on the shelves along with the Avalon Hill games. But for me, it was Avalon Hill and GDW. Those were the companies I could see that put out war games. And even really off-brand stuff did, but I never found SPI near me, which was kind of odd. What about the game system itself? It doesn't present that different a game from what those older styles did. It really doesn't. It's a game where you're going to be cracking the numbers. You have to put a lot of thought into what you can move where. There's geometry in terms of trying, to cut off retreats, to remove supply from people. It's a nicely, cleanly written rules, except for, I argue that the supply rules are not that clean, I believe. The procedure section of the supply rules kind of is at odds with some of the more rigorous case sections, and it just leads you to this, what are they talking about exactly? And it seems the procedure is actually the correct thing. Trying to remember. The main question I had is why the hell you'd be counting movement at the mechanized rate through roads. That is really the one thing that's kind of funky there, is why is that even there? And there are some special cases where that's necessary, but that's really the thing that led me to kind of feel. But overall, the rules are pretty damn clear, and I could see someone who picks this up having no problem whatsoever with it. Or it being a good introductory game, at least. It's a little... one kind of disturbing thing was the need to put the additional Soviet reinforcements on the track. out of the dead pile at some point in the game. That was more bothersome probably as someone who's used to playing war games from this era. Yeah, what did they get it down to? It was 100 pieces. That's what they got. The combat results, I don't know how much more variable. It feels like a more random game than a lot of the SPI games of the same era. But I'm not sure quite why. The combat results table, first of all, until you hit 6-1 odds, you're not going to get a guaranteed elimination. There is always the option for the defender to give up space rather than take casualties. And the 1-2 is where attacker eliminated results start coming in. The attacker quite often is more willing, like if they just lose a battle, they're probably more willing to scatter and get away from it. So it's not as random in some ways as the old Avalon Hill chart, where 1-1 has an attacker eliminated and a defender eliminated on it, and it's kind of like, wow, that's pretty severe. But it did feel like I was waiting on die rolls in a lot of cases. That may be the small size of the game. That each die roll is more important. I'm only going to be making a couple of attacks a turn. So it's kind of if one of them doesn't go, if one of them goes in the worst direction possible or whatever, that could be a pretty big deal. Or if several rounds of not being able to destroy a defensive position you go through, that may be a big deal. It's got the idea of overruns in it, which you see at the end of my playthrough as well at the very beginning. But for most of the middle section of the game, I didn't really find them terribly helpful because I'm in the siege situation. I feel like I don't want to take that bad odds roll. Early in the game, you want to take it because you want to gain territory quickly, and that territory that you're gaining quickly is, pretty vital to try to cut off the enemy. But once you get into that kind of siege situation, it becomes a lot harder to justify taking a couple column shifts against you, which may end up failing completely. The early part of the game, you're just able to overrun some of the Russian pieces in the first turn or two and force your way into their line. It does, putting the overrun in play does make for a more mobile flavor of game. That is your breakthrough mechanism in this design. It's got the untried units. That's another thing that basically was getting some play at the time with the VCS, what later became the VCS system, the Victory in the West games, which were coming out at about the same time. A little different here where, it's just the Soviet units and they just have a value on the back of them. It seems to work perfectly fine in terms of the uncertainty there. In fact, it feels almost like you're a little too certain later in the game when you get settled down to that siege of Leningrad, basically, where you are able to just crunch the odds numbers. And again, that becomes a different kind of thinking, like where you're randomizing what you're facing and you don't really know what it is, and you put that extra layer of uncertainty between the odds and the actual odds chart and the pieces on the board, so that the player really doesn't know what they're going to be running up against. That becomes a level at which you don't have the same sit here and calculate the odds exactly and try to get your pieces exactly lined up so that they can work that way. So this kind of gently eases you into that kind of thinking of, I want to get the exact right strength points into play. That was still pretty common overall. Trying to think of anything else that I really want to say about it. It's an okay game. It definitely is an okay game. There's nothing wrong with it. It's well presented. It's small. probably plays in a couple hours. Took me longer, but he had a lot of. It probably took about 3 hours, I would say, and I think that's about right. It's 12 turns, I could see some people playing it quicker. I could see other people really trying to optimize their play to a certain degree. Like a lot of these games, it feels like it's fairly applicable to the competitive player. Although, again, I got this feeling of a little bit more luck than maybe, and it may be the situation of the game more than the actual system, than the truly competitive players enjoy as much. It felt like there's a little bit too much of a chance for the dice to screw you over because there's just a couple of key die rolls. Same reason that Africa Core is, such a problem. But there isn't a single location where you're going to have that single die roll that you have to get on turn X and it just kind of determines the game. There's nothing along those lines, I think, in this. It's just a matter, and I wouldn't have found that in Africa Core because I don't play things. I browse games. I play it, Will I ever play this again is a good question. As far as something for somebody to pick up nowadays, I don't know. My choice was because, hey, the designer is someone who did 2 really cool games, and I wanted to see the only other game that he designed. And it had some positive reviews on it. There's no question about that, but it also is more or less what I expected. A kind of cute, small treatment of this advance in the North. I wouldn't say, in no way is this more, this is less than the average S&T game of the same period. You're getting less for it. So, well, the fact that it's in a box meant you were paying probably $8-10 instead of $2.50 for a subscription, $5 for a new copy. For whatever reason, nostalgia, whatever, Decision Games reprinted this. I have no idea what decides their reprint strategy. To me, it feels like it belongs as a folio game. Nowadays, that probably would go for $10 or so. I think they reprinted it with a box, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I don't know. Who knows? I don't know if it's in a box or not. But you're getting the same kind of experience that you got out of maybe some of the earlier S&T magazine games where they hadn't started putting more and more earlier than this period. This was 79, go back to 75, 76. Some of them were pretty small. Few of them, I think, were greatly replayable. But is this replayable? Sure. Because there's enough variance in it that, you can play it as many times as you like. Is it interesting to do so? Not so much. Simply because this ground had already been covered, even by the time this was published, in terms of, we're putting out these simple kind of competitive games where you're trying to trying to outflank the enemy or whatever and cut his supply and stuff like that. And, that sort of puzzle space is gone. And the historical richness that it provides, the type of story that it provides, is pretty limited, to tell you the truth. And you would expect so from 100 counters, right? So you're not going to see a lot of depth of story here. There are earlier games that were of similar type. The only thing that can really make something like this maybe more excitable, more exciting to someone in my position is make it really big. You know, take that Europa plunge, the old Europa, not whatever monstrosity it's become over the years. I've started to hear people say, "Stop calling Europa, you know, a big dumb monster. It's gotten more complex. The diffraction games are actually not that far off of it." um, but yeah, the my feeling is always, yeah. Do I really want to play a big dumb monster? Not even that doesn't terribly excite me. Although I've had some fun with some of the SCS games that have come out and everything. But really, it's kind of at a point of with so much in the hobby, so many games already available, etc. Something has to kind of shine to be worth going back and digging. And this is not bad at all. This is not bad at all. If you see a copy of it and you don't have a whole hell of a lot of games, if you don't have anything on this particular subject, and I kind of don't think I do until you hit OCS, or things that cover, you know, I have things like Stalingrad that cover the whole front. But it's kind of interesting to see it just from the Army Group North perspective or whatever, I guess. I don't know. It's World War II, man. It bores me. Yeah, so East Front just doesn't get more boring for me. Yeah, it's... I mean, it's a serviceable game, and I think that people who would enjoy this kind of game would enjoy it. I didn't mind it. It served the place I wanted, which was this sort of comfort food. I want something small to fill in the gaps so that I can make it through this horror that I'm playing right now that's called Invasions. All right, let's send it up. Told you I didn't have much to say at the end of the playthrough. But I sure stretched it out, didn't I?